Great, thank you for your patience. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Allison. I'm part of the education department at the Timken. And thank you so much for joining us for our special tour today. So those of you who have been here before might know that we usually do a tour of the whole museum, of the collection, different galleries, but we wanted to focus today on our Dutch and Flemish gallery. And we're doing so with one of our docents who, this is her favorite gallery, so you're getting the tour from the right person. A couple of guidelines before we begin. If you're here in our Zoom room, we ask that you mute yourself while our docent is speaking so that everyone can hear her well. If you have any questions during the tour, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box in the Zoom. So there's that little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions there and then we'll get to them at the end. If you are on Facebook watching this, you can also ask questions and you can put them in the chat or that little comment box on the live stream on Facebook too, and we'll get to your questions. So with that, I want to introduce our docent for the day, Eleanor Merle. Eleanor has been one of our newest docents, but now she is a veteran with these virtual tours. So we're happy to have her with us and we're happy to hear her talk about her favorite gallery. So take it away, Eleanor.
Thank you, Allison. Well, greetings and welcome to a tour of masterpieces of the Timken Museum from the Dutch and Flemish Gallery. My name, as Allison said, is Eleanor Merle, and I'm delighted to be your docent for today's tour. Now, a bit of background will help in understanding the works in this gallery, consisting of artists who are either Dutch or Flemish. I'll start with a map of the Netherlands, which does show that in the 17th century, the Netherlands was divided into two different areas. The northern Netherlands, this darker greenish kind of area, and the southern Netherlands. Now, the southern Netherlands was a Catholic country under rule of the Spanish Habsburgs. Its people were referred to as Flemish, which derives from Flanders, its largest and richest county. Artists from the Spanish Netherlands generally painted in the Baroque style, which was characterized by great drama, rich, deep color, and intense light and dark shadows. Now we find quite a different story in the north. The 17th century in the north was a period in Dutch history known as the Dutch Golden Age. It was a unique era of political, economic, and cultural greatness during which the newly minted country of Holland ranked among the most powerful and influential in Europe and the world, erupting with artists of such skill and inventiveness they continue to enthrall to this day. So, what accounted for this burst of genius? Well, three words: independence, prosperity, and Protestantism can explain 17th century Holland. After a long, victorious war of independence from Spain, a new ruling class emerges that quickly garners immense riches from its maritime empire. And how did the Dutch spend their newfound wealth? Well, recall that Calvinism, the form of Protestantism prevalent in the North, forbade any type of pretension, ostentation, or self-aggrandizement, any sin of pride. So these strict Calvinists couldn't display or consume evidence of their success, for example, landed estates or sartorial splendor. The only material objects that flew under the radar were paintings. So they commissioned paintings, and for the few short decades, an entire body of truly brilliant artists arose, wonderfully capable of meeting the challenge. They painted in a new style of realism, referring back to early Netherlandish artists like Jan van Eyck. So what did they paint? Well, Calvinism forbade what had been the primary source of funding and imagery, the church and ecclesiastical images. Rather, painters turned to art that reflects themselves, that tells them who they are and what they aspire to. Toward this end, artists devised four categories of painting, which they either invent, innovate, or elevate. Three are unique to the Dutch, and let's start with the first one being genre art. Genre art are paintings that celebrate their daily lives. Such art was totally unknown in other countries, and an explanation perhaps resides in the Dutch love of their home and the family it shelters. Second, they innovate and bring life into still lives. The Dutch virtually invented still lives, evidenced by the fact that the English term derives from the Dutch word still even, things that stand still. Up until then, still lives were mere wall decorations or space keepers. Third, they celebrate landscape, raising it to the status of primary subject matter. Before, it was secondary, a stage setting for actions, but not for the Dutch who loved their flat, uninspired, and uninspiring landscape. They fought hard for every meter of that land against the Spanish and the sea, and it was a great source of pride. The fourth category is portraits, which of course the Dutch didn't invent. But then there was Rembrandt, with whom we could open and close the discussions. But there's much more to Dutch portraiture than Rembrandt. There's Frans Hals. I'm excited to share with you examples of each of these new styles or genre in our tour today. But let's step back to begin with the earliest work in the gallery, Death of the Virgin, which dates from 1460 to 65 by the artist Petrus Christus. This is one of less than 40 known works of Petrus Christus, who excelled in portraits and religious work. Petrus Christus was a second generation Flemish artist who lived in Bruges, the Flemish center of commerce, from 1444 until his death. While he was too late to study with the court painter Jan van Eyck, Christus was greatly influenced by that master's work. Specifically, Christus combined the jewel-like colors and interplay of light achieved through the Flemish breakthroughs in the use of oil paints and glazing techniques associated with Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, and was the first Flemish artist to utilize the Florentine one-point perspective system of the architects Brunelleschi and Alberti. And if you can imagine for a moment, you can best visualize this one-point perspective by understanding that this work, as it was originally created, had two additional wings forming a triptych. Unfortunately, those two wings were destroyed in 1945 in a fire, of course, during World War II. Being the artist's largest work suggests it was intended as an altarpiece, likely created for a wealthy patron for use as a devotional object in a private chapel. The story of Death of the Virgin is recounted in the Golden Legend, where there are details of the gathering of the apostles from all over the world. What makes the painting so unusual is that it shows three episodes of the story in one painting, tied together by the color red. Now, the scene takes place in a Dutch bedroom, and we know this because the bed curtains are folded into themselves. And here are the three stories. First, Death or the Dormition, or Falling Asleep of Mary. She's laying on the bed holding a candle, a symbol of her faith. The apostles have gathered to give her the last rites, and they all look tired with flat faces. They've come from all over the world. They've got dark circles under and around their red eyes, and at least one appears in the corner here to be asleep. Most are barefoot, perhaps because being barefoot can mean you're in the presence of someone holy, or in recognition of mourning. The second story is the one of the angels bearing Mary's soul to heaven, where God the Father welcomes her with open arms. And finally, we have Following the Red, we have Doubting Thomas, where we see an angel dropping the Virgin's girdle to St. Thomas as proof of her assumption, body and soul, into heaven. So ends the story of death of the Virgin. Now, moving to the 16th century, we have a work by Pieter Bruegel the Elder, considered one of the greatest Flemish, Netherlandish 16th century painters. More than any other painter, he helped free landscapes from its dependence on religion. In this painting, Bruegel depicts the Bible's parable of the sower, partly as a reflection of the newly grasped sense of the vastness and variety of the earth. Remember the importance of the Dutch in world trade at this time. Painters began increasing the space and depth of their landscape background. So in the distance of this painting, you can see ships are well on their way out to sea, indicating trade and a busy port. Bruegel had recently returned to Antwerp following a 2-year stay in Rome, and this landscape from 1557 is an evocation of scenery he had seen on his trip. So clearly, you do not have the flat Netherlands landscape. The biblical story is played out in the foreground at the left, where a humble peasant scatters seeds on rocky soil. Notice the tree stump. The house behind him is lit by morning sun. According to St. Matthew, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the small birds devoured them, and some fell in stony places where they didn't have much earth, and some fell among thorns. But other seeds fell into good ground and brought forth root. Now, the picture is cut diagonally with a wide river, indicating that there are two parts to the story. At the lower right, a dirt road leads you down a path through the river and descends into the river. And on the far bank over here, and I'll enlarge this a bit, on the far bank, a small group of people gather to listen to Jesus deliver his message of salvation. And like the seeds falling on the soil, some will not listen to him, but others will heed his words, and faith will blossom in them. Moving forward in time, one of the most important landscape artists of the Dutch Golden Age was Jacob van Ruysdael. There was arguably no 17th century Dutch artist who captured the flatness and expanse of the Dutch landscape better than van Ruysdael. This work, A View of Haarlem and the Bleaching Fields, was done in 1665 to 1670. Now, Jacob van Ruysdael learned to paint from his father, a frame maker, art dealer, and painter, and from his uncle. After studying landscape painting in Germany for 10 years, he settled in Amsterdam, and there he maintained a flourishing painting studio where he trained the next generation of Dutch landscape painters. The subject of this painting is the bleaching of cloth and clothing. Next to brewing, bleaching, and you can see the bleaching clothing right over here. Next to brewing, bleaching was the most important industry in Haarlem, and the renown of Haarlem bleaching was such that visitors from foreign locales, as well as from the city, visited the countryside to see the process in action. Outsiders might have purchased images like this as souvenirs. More likely, though, the owners of such paintings were Dutch, for whom the landscape was a point of. The various steps in the bleaching of linen occurred over a period of 7 months. The sand dunes surrounding Haarlem provided the best linen bleaching conditions in Europe, and the lucrative dairy industry provided the byproduct of buttermilk, which would have been discarded had it not been used for bleaching. Depicted from a raised vantage point, the landscape occupying the lower third of the canvas is flat and expansive. The artist arranges the buildings and rows of linen to lead the eye diagonally through alternated areas of shadow and light. In contrast to the enormous, puffy cumulus clouds above, the land is marked by carefully plotted fields, tiny houses, and detailed greenery. Sky and earth are separated by a nearly straight horizontal line, which was typical of Dutch Golden Age landscapes. The presence of St. Bavo's Church on the horizon identifies the city beyond as Haarlem, at the same time suggesting the role of divine providence in the success of the Dutch. Van Riesdael completed about 15 views of Haarlem, showing the linen bleaching fields. In addition to making 700 paintings, Riesdael received a medical degree in 1676 and probably pursued a successful secondary career as a surgeon. He died in 1682 and is buried in St. Bavo's. Let's now move on to another of the genre associated with the Dutch, the still life. And here's a still life by Pieter Cles. Cles was the foremost still life painter in Haarlem, the leading center of artistic life in 17th century Holland. And this work was done in 1627, early in his career. Cles specialized in a type of still life that his countrymen called breakfast pieces, which are comprised of ingredients from an ordinary, informal meal. Smoking supplies, a goblet of dark beer, a brazier with glowing embers, and they're all arranged around a pewter plate with smoked herring in the foreground. Remarkable and new in this type of still life is the implied presence of an individual who may have been interrupted in his meal and will return. But Cles also knew about the material possessions of a wealthy household and painted those on occasion. Known as vanitas paintings, these works are ripe with symbolic objects intended to emphasize the transience of life, the futility of earthly pleasure, and the pointless quest for power and glory. The ever-present morality and humility central to the Calvinist faith tempered Dutch pride in worldly goods. Now, vanitas are closely related to the earlier tradition of memento mori, Latin for remember you must die. Artworks which were intended to prompt viewers to consider their mortality. Unlike memento mori art, vanitas paintings also include other symbols, such as musical instruments, wine, and books, to remind us explicitly of the futility of worldly pleasures and goods. Note the violin, its shape reminiscent of a female body. In addition to the tipped over goblet and a skull in the corner here, which serves a moralizing message on the ephemerality of sensory pleasure. The humble spread shown in the Timken picture suggests different ideas. Whoever consumes this mural doesn't necessarily need to be reminded that the good life only lasts a little while. This particular example of the breakfast pieces genre represents what ordinary life in Haarlem might have been like. I'm now privileged to present the museum's Rembrandt, the only painting in San Diego by the most important Dutch artist. This work from 1657 is the Apostle Saint Bartholomew. Rembrandt van Rijn is one of the greatest artists of all time, acclaimed for his compelling representations of the human condition. He captures the inner life and feelings of his subjects. Known primarily for his portraits and landscapes, He remained interested throughout his life in history and biblical painting, turning repeatedly to the Bible as a source of inspiration. Despite the considerable wealth and notoriety Rembrandt achieved early in his career, the 1650s was an extremely difficult time for him. His beloved first wife, Saskia, had passed away. His housekeeper had borne a child out of wedlock, bringing great criticism. When she died, Rembrandt remarried Hendrik to help care for his son Titus. His commissions declined and he lost money in speculative investments, forcing him into bankruptcy in order to avoid imprisonment. All his goods, including an impressive collection of paintings, were sold off, and he had to move to a much poorer district of town. Among the works Rembrandt did during this dark period in his life was this portrait of the Apostle Saint Bartholomew, one of the disciples of Christ. Flayed alive for his beliefs, he is holding in his right hand a butcher's knife, the symbol or attribute of his martyrdom. Rembrandt's portrayal of a relatively youthful man with rugged features reflects his own vision of biblical figures as unidealized real people who walk the earth with passions and beliefs, with fears and with anxieties similar to those felt by the rest of humanity. Saint Bartholomew leans slightly forward in a low-backed chair, his gaze averted to the viewer's left eyebrow cocked. Strong light brilliantly illuminates the right side of his face, revealing his hollow cheek and furrowed brow. His expression is of deep thought, suggesting he might be contemplating his own demise. He's dressed in a plain brown robe over a white shirt, the cuff of which shows radiantly in white at his wrist. A heavier, buff-colored cloak covers the chair. Notice Rembrandt's celebration of texture through the impasto technique of applying thick layers of paint. We see this around the apostle's face, and again reinforcing his furrowed brow and expression, as well as with this burst of white at his cuff. This is achieved by using the butt of his brush. Now, coincident with Rembrandt's time is Anthony van Dyck, and here is his portrait of Mary Villiers, Lady Herbert of Sherlin, from 1636, about 20 years earlier. Anthony van Dyck, a Flemish Baroque artist, was born in 1599 in Antwerp to a wealthy silk merchant. He was a very talented, precocious youth who started his training at age 10 and became an independent artist at 16. He was the most important assistant of the leading northern painter of the day, Peter Paul Rubens. And while he never surpassed Rubens in terms of popularity, he achieved international fame with his work. In 1632, Van Dyck was invited to the court of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria of England. That same year, he was knighted by Charles I and made their Majesty's principal court painter. Charles commissioned numerous portraits from Van Dyck, not only for members of his own family, but also for foreign friends and ambassadors. Mary Villiers was raised in the royal household, where she enjoyed the status of a princess. Charles I arranged her marriage when she was only 12 to Charles Lord Herbert, who was 15, the oldest son of Lord Pembroke, who was one of Van Dyck's earliest patrons. Tragically, Lord Herbert died of smallpox just 2 years later in 1636, which is when this portrait was commissioned by Charles I. Though Mary was only 14 years old at the time of this work, she emerges from the plain, dark background in dignified splendor, pointing to one of the black ribbons that suggests her recent widowhood. Heavy pearls at her neck and drop pearlings at her ears. And she wears the latest fashion, a glowing, low-cut taffeta gown trimmed with silvery lace. Her calm, dispassionate gaze, like her pale skin, signify aristocratic refinement. Now, a question might be whether Lady Villiers borrowed Queen Henrietta Maria's pearls, which were later known as the Mancini pearls. And I want to show you another portrait by Van Dyck of Queen Marietta. It was done the same year that Lady Villiers was done, a similar dress, also black ribbon of mourning, and she too is wearing what appear to be the same set of pearls, and hidden somewhat by her hair in the same style are the drop earrings. So Mary might well have borrowed those pearls, or Van Dyck might have asked that they be used for the portrait. Now, sadly, Lady Mary Villiers' string of losses didn't end with the death of her first husband. Two subsequent husbands predeceased her, as did both her children. At age 10, her son, and 18, her daughter. In the 17th century, demand for portraits was greater than for any other types of work, and everyone wanted to be painted by Van Dyck. I would note at this point that the population of Holland was about 1.8 million, and there were about 1.5 million portraits done. So portraits were the most favorable genre of art. And Van Dyck was so popular because he was one of the first fashionable portrait painters, able to give an appearance of refined elegance to subjects who lacked those qualities. And he was quite a flamboyant character himself, always wearing a sunflower because it was greatly admired by Charles I. Here's a very well-known self-portrait which nicely depicts the artist's personality. Van Dyck spent the remainder of his life in the British court. He received a quiet house of his own, along with a handsome pension of £200 annually from the court. And he was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, an indication of his standing at the time of his death. He transformed British portraiture by banishing the stiff, Tudor, and Jacobean images and developing his distinctive, fluid, shimmering style that came to dominate portraiture in Britain until the early 20th century. We'll now return from England to the Netherlands and visit with Frans Hals, the leading portrait painter in Haarlem in the 17th century. And here we have Portrait of a Man, painted in 1634. This portrait depicts a middle-aged man, age 48, according to the inscription, which appears prominently in the upper right above the date and Hal's own initial. Sadly, we don't see that very well. You can see the shadow of the text here. We're pretty sure that he was married, as his wife had her portrait by Hals painted at the same time. And both these paintings are on identically sized oak panels. And here's the painting of his wife. I believe it's in the Detroit Museum of Art. And you could see similar size, similar collar. Now, our sitter has a slightly florid complexion, thinning brown hair, light brown pointed beard. His hand is raised to his chest, pointing toward his face, perhaps to bring attention to it. He's dressed in the black regent robe of a governor, with a black mantle over his left shoulder and a large white ruff collar. The subject glances at the viewer in a spontaneous manner, appearing to be a jolly and affable fellow. His crinkly eyes and a small smile makes us think he's going to break out into a broader smile or talk with us. Notice the spectacular detail of the collar, a similar one, as I mentioned, worn by his wife. It's almost transparent. It appears to reflect light to the sitter's face. The round and flat variation is often called a millstone collar after its resemblance to that object. The collar's stiffness forced upright posture, and their impracticality led them to become a symbol of wealth and status. The bigger, the better. I've read that some of them could be 1 foot wide. A sign of Hall's skill is that he painted this intricate collar directly on the canvas with no underlying drawing. Frans Hals was born in Antwerp to a weaver who became a painter, but like many of Hals' family, he emigrated from the Spanish Netherlands to Haarlem in 1585 when Antwerp was captured by Spanish forces. In 1610, at age 27, he enrolled as a member of Haarlem's Artists Guild and he set up his workshop. And by the 1620s, he was considered the leading portrait painter in Haarlem. He used strong color and loose slashing sketch-like brushwork to give vitality to his portraits. His strokes are clearly visible at close inspection, but from a distance, his paintings form coherent images that capture the immediacy of the moment. We can marvel at the artist's method, his skill, and his skills at conjuring personality with a few swiftly applied daubs of paint. Later in life, his love of beer and wine that was celebrated in his paintings spilled over into his personal life. With 10 children and a brawling second wife who was often in trouble with the law, he fell out of favor. His creditor took him to court several times, and to settle a bakery debt in 1652, he sold his belongings. Left destitute, the municipality gave him an annuity in 1664, and he too is buried in St. Bavo's Church in Haarlem. We'll complete today's tour with the smallest painting in the Timken collection, called A Lady Receiving a Letter. Done in 1658 by Gabriel Metsu, the painting is part of a Dutch tradition of genre painting dealing with the popular subject of the love letter. Writing letters became fashionable in Europe in the 17th century after the establishment of a postal system. In the Dutch Republic, education, that was the North, education was strongly emphasized, and the population, was quite literate. I apologize. Okay, the Netherlandish people loved writing letters. We know that the secretary to the Prince of Orange wrote 80,000 letters in his lifetime. This love of letters brings us to this small picture, a scene from everyday life. The Dutch, by the way, developed the first postal system. They were such avid letter writers. As I mentioned, they loved writing letters, and we know that the secretary to the Prince of Orange wrote 80,000 letters. Now, the young woman in the Timken painting is shown in an elegant garden setting, framed by the arches of an open arcade through which we can glimpse a grand Palladian villa in the distance, conveying elegance and wealth. The delivery of a letter by a messenger, noted by his black hat, appears to have interrupted the young woman who sits with an open book in her lap. As to the identity of the letter writer, art historians are quite certain that the gentleman in another Metsu painting, a man writing a letter now in the collection of the Musée Fabre Montpellier, is the man in question. There's persuasive evidence that this other work is the pendant painting. Their comparable size and complementary 3/4 length format support the assumption that Metsu conceived them as pendants or companion pieces, A close review of both pictures show that both desks are at the same level and both the individual's hands are in essentially the same position. Each also includes a second person. Notably, they appeared as a pair in 3 separate sales in the early 19th century. According to a leading scholar of Metsu's work, Metsu represented himself as the man in the Montpellier painting and his wife, Isabella, as the model for the Timkens work. Gabriel Metsu was born to the Flemish painter Jacques Metsu, and he spent a good portion of his life in Leyden, where he was a member of the Painting Guild. He left in his 20s after a scandal involving his visit to a brothel, and it was believed that he'd quit painting, but this isn't the case, as several of his works surfaced after he left the guild. Now, let me leave you in closing with a bit of postal trivia. A recently rediscovered trunk containing 2,600 letters from throughout Europe and the Netherlands between 1689 and 1706 will soon provide a fascinating glimpse into the plight of the early modern European everyman. These letters remained undelivered, including 600 letters that were never opened because their recipients couldn't be found or the recipients wouldn't pay the outstanding postage costs. The trunk has been stored in The Hague's Museum for Communication since 1926. Now, an international team of experts from various universities is exploring each letter in a groundbreaking project called Signed, Sealed, and Undelivered. Our tour has now come to a close. I know it's been quite a whirlwind run through the Dutch and Flemish Gallery, and hope you enjoyed hearing the stories our masterworks have to tell. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. We can all give her a virtual round of applause. I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. We have a bit of time for a Q&A, whether you're on Facebook or on our Zoom room. On Facebook, like I said earlier, you can put your comment in the chat. And if you're in our Zoom room, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question now. And we have some thank yous in the chat as well, Eleanor.
Thank you. Somehow I'm not seeing chat, but I know it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Allison.
Any questions? I can go ahead and get one started while people are thinking maybe. I thought it was really interesting what you said at the beginning, sort of that shift from religious to more secular paintings. And I was curious how that reception of them would have changed too.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, the real driver of that was Protestantism, and the northern Netherlands were Calvinists, which was a very strict form of Protestantism, which absolutely forbid any ecclesiastical themes and any images to be in their churches. Their churches are very spare. But as I mentioned in the introduction, the Dutch were quite prosperous. You know, they were wealthy merchants. You know, they were in the Dutch Golden Age. That's what they were known for, their maritime industry, their trade. But Calvinism would not allow them to spend money on ostentatious things. Yet paintings were not deemed ostentatious. I think I used the terminology, they flew under the radar. So the artists turned all their attention to paintings, and they couldn't paint ecclesiastical schemes. There was no market for that. In fact, they sold their paintings in the open market. They didn't work on commissions. They brought their paintings to the open market, and every Dutch home in the north had paintings in them, you know, one or more paintings. As I mentioned, they loved the portraits. They loved painting themselves and their prosperity. They were very prideful of their land, so they loved, you know, the flat landscapes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I always think it's really interesting when we do have these periods in history where religious art is kind of either banned or not in favor. I don't know, my mind goes back to like I studied Byzantine art. And so like iconoclasm there, and seeing their reaction to that, because people still have this need to make art and they still want art in their lives. So when they can't have religious art, it's interesting to see like what they turn to. And that's how we get these other genres of secular painting. So that's really interesting. And also, yeah, interesting to see kind of how their prosperity also manifests itself. Anyone else have any other questions? You can unmute yourself, like I said. No. And I don't see any on Facebook either. So maybe that's it. Well, thank you so much again, Eleanor. We do have one announcement if you want to go to that slide.
Sure.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to let you all know that we do have a Valentine's Day event coming up, a virtual event where, if you may remember, we did those ornament making workshops back in December. And so we have another one coming up for Valentine's Day where you can make this beautiful card that you see. So there's that card with some kind of like a bouquet of flowers coming out, and then it'll also close. So it looks like a card. So you can give it as a gift or just do a little date night and make it with your significant other, whoever. The class will be taught by Bhavna Mehta, who is our 2018 Summer Artist in Residence. So if you went to the Timken during that time, you might have seen her installation. And so she's back to teach this class, which is really exciting to hear from a true artist. So if you would like to register, you can register online, and then we'll ship all of the materials to you. So you don't need to come pick anything up. And then the workshop is on Zoom. So this is a totally socially distanced event. To register, you can go to the link that I have there. So timkenmuseum.org/calendar. If you go to our website, you can always just hit the events tab and see what things we have coming up. And then if you're on Facebook, we actually have a Facebook event for it. So if you go to the event tabs on our Facebook page, you should see it come up as one of the first things as well. So we hope to see you there. That's February 11th at 4 p.m., 4 to 6 p.m. that day. So a nice little Valentine's Day event. But until then, we hope to see you next week at 11 a.m. on Thursday, same time, same place for another tour. And, you know, this week we did the Dutch Flemish Gallery. And so we're kind of gonna keep going on these kind of more specialized tours. And next week we will be doing a tour of the French Gallery. So we hope to see you there. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you.